Welcome to a tutorial video on JavaScript and Ink. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Story API. Now, in the previous video, I talked a little bit about the Ink for Web option. When we're using the Inky editor, we can choose from the file menu Ink for Web. It created an HTML file, 3 JavaScript files, and a CSS file. Now, if we're not as interested in working directly in the web, we can also use JavaScript from the command line. We can do that through using the node package ink.js. Notice right here, I've loaded that in my package.json file. I've set a dependency of this project is ink.js. So we can load that through using the command line, npm install ink.js, or in this case, since I'm using the online repo service, I've just included that as an extra package. So we can use ink.js to still write JavaScript, to work with JavaScript and Ink. But in this case, we can sort of abstract it out, work with just JavaScript to talk through the API, and then in later videos come back to HTML and talk about designing interfaces in that area. So in this video, as I mentioned, I wanted to talk about a little bit more about the Story API. I introduced bits in the previous video. We talked about can continue, there's a true or false to see if the story is ended or not. We talked a little bit about the continue function. We check can continue. If we can continue, we call the continue function. And that gives us, loads the next bit of the story, gives us the next text, loads the next choices. And I talked a little bit about the current choices collection that's part of the story object that sort of gives us the current choices. Let's back up a second, and I'm going to look at the actual Ink programming for this. So we see we have a very standard beginning sentence. We have our first divert that goes to this knot right here. This knot has 4 choices that go to other knots: pizza, sushi, salad, and nothing. If we choose sushi, it ends. Everything else points us back to that knot. So we sort of have a repeating structure here unless we choose the right response. So I'm going to come over here to my index.js file, and we're going to talk about using the ink.js module in Node. Same JavaScript API, but a slightly different context. And another way we can work with the JavaScript and Ink interfaces together. So the very first thing I'm doing is loading the story object. We're going to need that to create a new story. I'm also using the FS or file system module. There are 2 different ways to load a Ink story within sort of this Node interface. The first of which is the way I'm doing right here. You do a read file sync on a file, and then you replace some extra characters that JSON would not normally understand. The other way you can do it, and depending on the environment, is you actually can just require the JSON file and use that as an object directly. It depends on context. The read file sync approach works everywhere. The require approach sort of depends on your environmental settings and what you're doing. For the repo, it doesn't work very well, and so I'm using the read file sync approach. All you really need to know is that I'm loading a JSON file that I've produced with the Inky editor. So I took this code, I put it into the Inky editor, I went File, produced a JSON file, which is what this is right here. This is a JSON file with everything together. And I'm now, right here on line 10, going to load it into a new story. In the previous video, when we were looking at Ink for Web, we saw a very similar setup, but it was using ink.js.story and then loading it. In this, since we're already loading ink.js, we're going to load the story object directly and avoid that extra step. But it's the same idea we saw in the previous video when we were looking at the Ink for Web interface. We're taking JSON, loading it into a new story object. The story object is going to be the interface through which we access everything. It is the Story API. So we've loaded our story, and we get the next text here. As I mentioned before, this continue function gets the next whatever. The next block of text, the next choices, it queues whatever is next. So in this case, we would see it was our first date and we hadn't made dinner plans. That would be, if we called continue and checked whatever it gave us, that would be the thing we saw. If we call it again right here, we would get, he turned to me, what should we eat? Which we expect to see right here. This was the first, then it was divert into the knot, and we would see that text next. And when it did that, it would load all of these choices, which it's done. And I mentioned in the previous video, we can look at the current choices property to see the entirety of the choices that were generated in whatever the next step was. So we did continue to get the next step, to get the first text, continue again to load the next text, and the next choices. So that's what we're part of using the story API. We're continually using the story function to drive itself forward. We can check to see can continue, true or false. If there's more story, we can continue. We call continue to load the next chunk every time, chunking away through the story, loading the next text, and also loading the next choices if they are available each time we're doing that. So the current choices are an array structure with text and also their index. The index is used to signal back to Inc. which choice was made in case it was associated with a divert or some other programming within Inc. itself. So in this video, I don't use that, but it's important to know there's a text of the choice and the index of the choice. The index is used to feed back into Inc. to say this choice was made, do something as a result. So right here, we see a for loop of choice of Inc. story current choices. So I'm going to run through them all and we'll print them as soon as this loads. And we see them right here, the text, pizza, sushi, salad, nothing, along with their corresponding indexes 0, 1, 2, and 3. So as you can see, we can start to use the story API in different ways here. I showed in the previous video how it was used as part of the Inc. for Web, and we will return to HTML in a later video. But to just sort of abstract it out and deal with the JavaScript and Inc. directly, we start to see we can load it using story object. We load the JSON into that, and we use the continue function to get the next chunk of the story. And if there are choices, we can use current choices as part of that story object to move through those, getting not only the text, but also their indices, which again I said can be fed back into Inc. to tell it, hey, I made this choice, and to move forward throughout the story. Thanks for watching.